Imagine for a moment a cottage in rural England. The year is somewhere around 1740. Outside, the night has settled in thick and quiet, and a fire burns low in the hearth. A young mother moves about the room by candlelight, tucking blankets, murmuring softly. And there, strung above the cradle, gently swaying from a beam in the ceiling, are braided ropes of onions, brown-skinned, papery, their faint, sharp smell drifting through the warm air.
To a modern eye, it looks peculiar, perhaps even a little amusing, but to that mother, in that cottage, in that world, it was one of the most loving things she could do. Tonight, we are going back to the kitchens and the hearths of early modern Europe and colonial America, to a time when medicine as we know it barely existed, and the distance between a healthy child and a very sick one could be measured in a single season. We are going to explore the world of folk remedies, superstition, and practical wisdom that shaped how ordinary people tried to protect the lives they loved most. And we will begin, as so many stories do, with something humble and pungent and surprisingly profound: the humble onion.
To understand why women hung onions near their babies, we have to first understand what life felt like in the 1700s. Infant mortality was not an abstract statistic, it was a reality woven into everyday life. In England, in France, in the American colonies, it was not unusual for a family to lose 2 or 3 children before they reached their 5th birthday. Smallpox, typhoid, whooping cough, cholera, diphtheria, these were not distant threats. They moved through villages like quiet shadows, slipping under doors, settling into lungs. A child could seem perfectly well at breakfast and be burning with fever by nightfall.
Doctors, where they existed at all, were expensive, unreliable, and often more dangerous than helpful. Their tools were limited: bloodletting, purges, emetics that left patients weaker than before. For the vast majority of ordinary families, professional medicine was simply not part of life. What they had instead was something older and more intimate: the accumulated knowledge of mothers and grandmothers, passed down through whispers and written in the margins of household books, the wisdom of midwives and herbalists, the memory of what had worked, or seemed to work, the last time sickness came. And in that world, the onion held a place of remarkable importance.
The belief in the protective and healing power of onions was ancient, far older than the 18th century. The Egyptians had revered it. Ancient Roman soldiers had carried it to war. Medieval plague doctors had burned it in the streets, believing its sharp vapors could drive away the pestilential air they called miasma. And this is where the thread of logic begins. For centuries, disease was understood not through germ theory. That understanding was still 100 years away, but through the idea of bad air, miasma. The word itself comes from the Greek for pollution or stain. Illness, people believed, arose from corrupt air, the fetid breath of swamps, the vapors rising from rotting things, the invisible clouds that hung over crowded, unwashed places. If bad air caused sickness, then strong air, sharp, purifying, overwhelming air, might repel it. And nothing produced stronger air than an onion. When a mother hung braided onions above her baby's cradle, she was not being superstitious in any empty sense. She was working within the best available theory of disease that her world had produced. She was creating, in her understanding, a kind of aromatic shield. The volatile compounds released by the onion, what we now know to be sulfur-based molecules called thiosulfonates, would fill the room with a scent so powerful that the miasma surely could not compete. She was, in her way, doing what she knew. There is something worth pausing on here before we continue.
It is easy, from the comfortable distance of the present, to smile at these old remedies, to shake our heads fondly at the onion and the garlic and the charms sewn into the hems of christening gowns. But the people who practiced these things were not foolish. They were resourceful. They were observant. They were doing exactly what humans have always done, making the best possible decisions with the information available to them. And sometimes, in ways that modern science has only recently begun to appreciate, they were not entirely wrong. Allicin, one of the sulfur compounds released when an onion is cut or bruised, does have genuine antimicrobial properties. Studies have confirmed it can inhibit the growth of certain bacteria and fungi. Raw onion applied to a wound, another common folk practice, may actually have provided some modest protection against infection, not because of any magical property, but because of chemistry that the old herbalists sensed without fully understanding.
The folk tradition, it turns out, had sometimes stumbled onto something real, but onions were only one thread in a much larger tapestry. In the colonies of early America and across the villages of Britain and Europe, the protection of a new baby was an elaborate and deeply felt practice. Infants occupied a kind of vulnerable middle territory in the popular imagination, too new to the world to be fully anchored in it, susceptible not just to illness, but to other, stranger dangers. The boundary between birth and death, between the spiritual and the physical, felt thin and porous when a newborn lay in its cradle. Salt was thought to be powerfully protective. Newborns in many parts of Scotland and northern England were rubbed with salt before their first bath, or a small dish of salt was left beside the cradle overnight. Salt preserved, salt purified. It had been used for centuries in religious ceremony, in Catholic baptismal rites, in the consecration of holy water. To place salt near a sleeping child was to invoke. Coral was another favorite charm. Wealthy families had necklaces of red coral crafted for their infants, and teething rings made from the same material. Red was the color of life and vitality. Coral was believed to guard against the evil eye, that old Mediterranean superstition that a jealous or malicious gaze could wither a child's health. It had the additional practical virtue of being smooth and hard, which made it useful for soothing sore gums, a rare case of the symbolic and the practical overlapping entirely. Iron was kept close to cradles, particularly in households with roots in Celtic tradition. A pair of open scissors hung above the bed, a nail hammered into the headboard. Iron, in the old lore, was proof against fairies and spirits who might steal a healthy child and leave behind something hollow in its place. The stories of changeling children, sickly, strange, unrecognizable as the child who had been there before, were almost certainly stories about children with undiagnosed illness, but the iron remained, just in case. And herbs, always herbs. The herb garden was the household pharmacy. Rosemary for memory and protection, lavender for calming and sleep. And here, again, there is something more than fancy at work, as lavender's sedative properties are well documented. Chamomile for a colicky stomach, elderflower for fever, thyme, which contains thymol, a genuine antiseptic, packed into sachets and laid under pillows. The women who kept these gardens and knew their uses were not fringe figures. They were the most practically knowledgeable people in their communities. The village herbalist or the exation. She knew which plants helped and which harmed. She knew the dangerous ones, the foxglove, the hemlock, and she knew the gentle ones. She passed this knowledge on carefully, and it was taken seriously. When Digitalis, the heart medication derived from foxglove, was first formally described by the physician William Withering in 1785, he was quite open about where he had learned of it. He had heard of a rural healer, a woman in Shropshire, who used an herbal mixture to treat what was then called dropsy, the swelling we now associate with heart failure. He investigated. He found something real. The foxglove tea she was giving her patients contained compounds that genuinely strengthened the failing heart. Centuries of folk medicine encoded in a remedy, waiting to be understood. There were other practices that had nothing to do with plants.
traditions woven so deeply into domestic life that they felt less like medicine and more like prayer, and perhaps they were both. In many parts of Europe, a new mother was not supposed to leave the house for 40 days after birth. This period, sometimes called the lying-in, was framed in religious terms. It recalled ancient purification rites, mirrored the 40 days of Lent, gave the new mother time to recover in the care of other women. But it also, practically, kept both mother and infant away from the wider community during those most fragile early weeks. It limited exposure. It enforced rest.
Visitors were welcomed but managed. Certain people were not permitted to see the baby until after baptism, which in Catholic and many Protestant traditions was performed quickly, sometimes within days of birth, precisely because the stakes felt so high. An unbaptized soul was vulnerable in ways that went beyond the physical. The ceremony that named the child, welcomed them into the community of the faithful, was also thought to seal them more firmly into the world of the living. Cold water was avoided, drafts were feared, windows were kept shut, and fires kept burning even in summer, in a way that must have made those small rooms very warm indeed. Modern medicine might raise an eyebrow. We know that fresh air is beneficial, that overheating can be dangerous, but in a world without antibiotics, where a simple chill could become pneumonia in days, the instinct to maintain warmth and shield against the cold was not unreasonable. It was the logical conclusion of observation. Sick babies and cold rooms seemed to go together. There is a tenderness in all of this that is easy to miss if we focus only on the strangeness. Consider the effort. Consider what it meant in a world of poverty and hard physical labor to spend careful time braiding onions, sewing sachets of rosemary, sourcing a piece of coral or a branch of rowan. These were not idle gestures. They were acts of love performed by people who had very limited tools. They were the expressions of a parent's most fundamental wish to protect this small person, to hold back the darkness for one more night. The mothers and fathers and grandmothers of the 18th century were not naive. They had usually buried children. They knew that some things could not be stopped, and still they hung the onions and laid out the salt and burned the lavender, because doing something, anything, in the face of helplessness is deeply, profoundly human. We still do it, of course. We do it differently. We sterilize and vaccinate and monitor, but the impulse is the same. The desire to stand between the ones we love and whatever threatens them, to do everything we can, and then a little more. By the early 19th century, the world of folk medicine began to shift, not suddenly, slowly, the way most change moves. Germ theory, developed in the 1860s by Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, finally gave disease a visible, comprehensible cause. The miasma theory faded. Vaccination, pioneered by Edward Jenner using cowpox to protect against smallpox, offered the first reliable tool against one of childhood's great killers. Hospitals, though still often dangerous, began to improve. The gap between folk practice and formal medicine began, very gradually, to close. But in the cottages and farmhouses, the old ways persisted alongside the new for a long time. An onion might still hang by the cradle, even as a doctor's pamphlet sat on the shelf. A grandmother might still rub salt on a newborn, even as a bottle of patent medicine stood in the cupboard. Tradition is slow to release its hold, especially when it is bound up with love and fear and memory. And it is worth noting, before we allow ourselves too much modern superiority, that folk medicine is not a closed chapter. Researchers today comb through old herbals and household books, looking for compounds that traditional practitioners had identified by instinct and observation. Willow bark tea, drunk for centuries against fever and headache, contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin. Turmeric, used for millennia in Ayurvedic medicine, contains curcumin, which has genuine anti-inflammatory properties. Honey, applied to wounds in ancient Egypt, does inhibit bacterial growth. The old remedies are being tested and retested. Some fail, some quietly pass. As the candle burns lower, let us rest for a moment in that quiet cottage again.
the fire crackling softly, the smell of onions drifting through the warm, still air, the baby sleeping. The mother who hung those onions above the cradle did not know what we know. She had never heard of bacteria or viruses or sulfur compounds. She could not have guessed that 3 centuries later, her great-great-grandchildren would have access to medicines that could cure in days what once killed in hours. But she knew her child was precious. She knew the world was uncertain. She knew that love required action, however imperfect. And so she did what she could, with what she had, in the way that made sense in the world she lived in.
That impulse, careful, tender, reaching toward protection, is one of the oldest things there is. It does not require a laboratory to be real. It does not need to be correct to be meaningful. It only needs to be love. And so the onions hung, and the salt was set out, and the lavender burned, and the baby slept, safe in the dim and fragrant warmth of a world doing its imperfect best, as perhaps we all are, even now. Sleep well.